The children of Israel had now successfully taken 2 cities in the Promised Land, after which they made the 40-mile journey to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Joshua read the entire Torah to the nation. Not a single word of the Torah was left out. Joshua 8, verse 35. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before the assembly of Israel, with the women, the little ones, and the strangers who were living among them. The words that Joshua read included the instructions that they were not to make a covenant with any nation that was already in the land. He singled out 6 nations: the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites. Each of these groups controlled a region of the Promised Land from a central fortified city. Now, what would these nations do in response to being singled out for destruction? How would the children of Israel be able to destroy the fortified cities and take possession of the land? I'm Dan Cathcart, and this is the Promise of Rest. The reputation and power of Jehovah preceded the Israelites' entrance into the Promised Land. The people of Jericho had heard how God parted the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross over on dry ground. They heard about Israel's victory over the kings of the east of Jordan. Now the hearts of all the nations west of the Jordan River were melted. Now these same nations apparently received a report about how Israel was to approach a city that they were to take in battle. Look at Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 11. When you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you. Now the city was to be given a chance to have peace with Israel and become servants or vassals to the nation of Israel. However, this offer of peace was only to be given to cities that were very far from them, especially those not in the Promised Land. For those cities near them, meaning the Promised Land, they were to utterly destroy them. Look at Deuteronomy 20, 15 through 18. Thus you shall do to all the cities which are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations, but of the cities of these peoples, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. You shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God had commanded you, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. Now our teaching today opens with Israel back in Gilgal, probably beginning to plan how they would take the Promised Land. They had already had the opportunity to view the land around Ai and the cities nearby. Now, while Israel was making their plans, the Canaanite nations began to make their plans in response to what they had heard about God's instructions to the children of Israel. Look at Joshua 9, 1 and 2. And it came to pass, when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills, and in the lowlands, and in all the coasts of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard about it, they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. However, not everyone was on board with this plan to fight Israel. The Gibeonites, a subgroup of Hivites, defected from the alliance and decided to pursue their own course of action regarding Israel. Now, we don't know much about the Hivites as a whole. The Hivites are mentioned as among the families of the descendants of Canaan. Now, we first encounter them when Prince Shechem of the city of Shechem saw Jacob's daughter Dinah and desired her and took her. In response, Jacob's sons Simeon and Levi slaughtered all the men of Shechem. Shechem was a city located in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Now, it's possible that the Hivites that were still living in the area reported back to Gibeon, the fortified city of the Hivites, and Joshua planned the entire destruction of the Hivite people. The leaders of Gibeon knew that God would destroy their city and kill all of their people because they had heard what had happened at both Jericho and Ai. So they worked out a plan to present themselves to the leaders of Israel as residents of a city very far from them. And they asked for peace according to Moses' instructions about how to treat cities that were not in the promised land. Look at Joshua 9, 3-6. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily, and they went and pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended, and old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments on themselves. And all the bread of their possession was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him, to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us." The men of Israel, of course, were skeptical and brought up Moses' conditions that they could only make a covenant with the cities far from them. Joshua 9, 7-8. Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you dwell among us, so how can we make a covenant with you?" But they said to Joshua, "We are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" Now the response of the Gibeonites was to flatter them with their knowledge of what God had done on behalf of Israel. They had heard of God's fame. Joshua 9, 9 and 10. So they said to him, "From a very far country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame, and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, to Og, king of Bashan, and who was at Ashtoreth." In keeping with the supposedly being from a far-off land, they did not mention hearing about what God had done recently when he gave Israel to the cities of Jericho and Ai. They carefully maintained their fiction that they were from a city outside of the Promised Land. They concluded their well-rehearsed speech with a declaration along the lines with the conditions outlined by Moses that they would be servants to Israel. Joshua 9, verse 11. Therefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, "Take provisions with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, 'We are your servants. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us.'" The Gibeonite statement that they would be Israel's servants was to be the clinching statement. They concluded with the implication that since all the conditions for making peace with the city were met, Israel should make a covenant with them, and they wanted it right now. They went on to point out the careful evidence that they had prepared to convince Joshua and the leaders of Israel that they had just completed a long journey. The men of Israel were finally convinced, and following Moses' instructions, accepted tribute from the Gibeonites and made peace with them. However, the men of Israel left out an important step. Like Joshua, when he was planning the conquest of Ai, the leaders forgot to consult with God. Look at Joshua 9, 14 and 15. Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. So Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them. Now the covenant was completed. The Gibeonites could breathe a sigh of relief. They would be allowed to live. But was this covenant binding on Israel because they had deceived Israel about where they had come from? God had singled out the Hivites as being among the nations that they were not to make a covenant with. The reason God gave that they were not to make a covenant with the nations in the Promised Land was because that they would cause Israel to sin against God. The 17th century theologian Matthew Poole comments on the possible loophole that may apply to the Gibeonites. But this law seems to admit of some exception and favorable interpretation, and that taken from the reason and soul of that law, which was this, that the Israelites might not be tainted with their idolatry and other abominations by cohabitation with them. And therefore, when that reason ceased, i.e., if they were willing to relinquish their possessions and idolatry and other wickedness, and to embrace the true religion, they might be spared. Matthew Poole cites the precedent of Rahab being accepted into Israel even though she and her family were Canaanites. He also points out God's kindness to the people of Nineveh when they repented. Finally, God's words to Jeremiah specifically state that God will spare a nation that turns from its evil ways. Look at Jeremiah 18, 7-8. The instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom to pluck up, to pull down, and to destroy it, if that nation against whom I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it. This raises the question of whether or not the Gibeonites were sincere in their desire to join Israel, and whether they gave up the worship of their gods in favor of worshiping Jehovah. So let's continue examining the account and see if we can shed some more light on this situation. 3 days after making a covenant with the Gibeonites, the Israelites found out that the Gibeonites lived near them in the Promised Land instead of a land far away. Now, when the leaders of Israel discovered the deception, they traveled to Gibeon to confront them about the deception. Joshua 9, 16-18. And it happened at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors who dwelt near them. Then the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the children of Israel did not attack them, because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. And all the congregation complained against the rulers. When they arrived, the armies of Israel let their leaders know that they were upset about the covenant they made with the Gibeonites. They wanted to attack the Gibeonites and destroy them as God had commanded. Now remember, all the people of the land were charem to the Lord. As charem, they were to be killed and burned. However, Israel had vowed to protect the Gibeonites so that they couldn't be killed. Joshua came up with a compromise. The Gibeonites would still be charem, just not in the same way as the rest of the Canaanites. Joshua 9, 19-21. Then all of the rulers said to all the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them. This we will do to them. We will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them." And the rulers said to them, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation, as the rulers had promised them." Joshua assigned the Gibeonites to be servants, cutting wood and carrying water for the congregation. Joshua clarified just what this meant when he confronted the leaders of Gibeon. Joshua 9, 22-23. Then Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us, saying, 'We are very far from you,' when you dwell near us? Now therefore you are cursed, and none of you shall be free from being slave woodcutters and water carriers for the house of God." The Gibeonites were assigned to be servants of God for the tabernacle. They were devoted, or karem, to God in his service as woodcutters and water carriers. As devoted to the Lord, they could not be redeemed, and their service belonged to God. None of them would be free from that service. Leviticus 27, verse 28. Nevertheless, no devoted offering that a man may devote to the Lord of all that he has, both man and beast, or the field of his possession, so shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted offering is most holy to the Lord. Now with this condition, Joshua upheld the law of charem, just as well as meeting the terms of the covenant that the Gibeonites would live and serve Israel. The Gibeonites were glad to accept this compromise. They explained that they knew they would be killed under the command of the God of Israel. They put themselves in Joshua's hands and accepted his decree. Joshua 9:24 and 25. So they answered Joshua and said, Because your servants were clearly told that the Lord your God commanded his servants Moses to give you all of the land and destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. Therefore we were very much afraid of our lives because of you, and have done this thing. And now we are here in your hands. Do with us as it seems good and right to do to us. Joshua and the Gibeonites agreed on the compromise. The scripture tells us that Joshua, whose name means salvation of Yah, saved the Gibeonites that day, and they became woodcutters and water carriers for the house of the Lord in every place where God chose to place his name. Joshua 9:26 and 27. So he did to them and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, so that they did not kill them. And that day Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord, in the place which he would choose, even to this day. Now we are still left with the question of whether Gibeon was sincere about rejecting their gods and turning to Jehovah, the God of Israel. The Bible doesn't directly answer that question. However, it gives hints that we look at to see what happened to the city of Gibeon and the Gibeonite people. As the children of Israel continue in their process of taking the promised land, God hardened the hearts of the leaders of the other cities. Joshua 11:19 through 20. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All the others they took in battle. For it was the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might utterly destroy them, and that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, as the Lord had commanded Moses. The only city that Israel made peace with was Gibeon and its satellite cities. When Joshua allotted the land to the 12 tribes, Gibeon was one of the major cities given to the tribe of Benjamin. Gibeon was selected to be one of the 4 cities Benjamin set aside as a city for the Levites in Joshua 21, verse 17. And it is fitting that Gibeon, whose residents were permanently servants to God and the tabernacle, be a city for the Levites, who were also in service to God. Now moving forward, at the time of David, there was a famine in the land. David asked the Lord about the reason for this famine. God revealed that it was a result of Saul's violence against the Gibeonites, breaking Israel's covenant with Gibeon. Look at 2 Samuel 21, verse 1. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, It is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. Also during the reign of David, the tabernacle of the Lord was at Gibeon. Solomon traveled to Gibeon when he became king to sacrifice to the Lord and ask him to give him wisdom to lead the people. 2 Chronicles 1, verse 3. Then Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon, for the tabernacle of meeting with God was there, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness. Now it seems then that the Gibeonites indeed honored their acceptance of the God of Israel as their God. The other Canaanite nations who had aligned together to stand against Israel were furious at the Gibeonites for making a covenant with Israel, and they turned their attention from defeating Israel to punishing Gibeon for her defection. Joshua 10, verses 3 through 4. Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Horam, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel. Now this opens the door for Israel to meet these armies in the open field instead of having to lay siege to their cities. Although the children of Israel were not to make a covenant with Gibeon and did so without consulting with God, God used it for his own purposes. In our next teaching, we will see the results of Israel's covenant with Gibeon and how God used it to facilitate Israel's possession of the land. I'm Dan Cathcart from Moed Ministries International. Shalom and be blessed.